The room smelled of formaldehyde and candle wax, a mixture that clung to the lungs like a curse. Imagine this: London, 1874. Midnight in the bowels of St. Bartholomew's Hospital. A medical student, lantern in hand, slips into the morgue for what he believes will be a harmless dare. But when he lifts the wick higher, he doesn't just find corpses laid neatly on iron slabs. He finds them arranged, their arms bent at unnatural angles, their faces tilted upward as if listening to something only the dead could hear. A whisper, low and insistent, seems to curl through the vaulted chamber. He swears he doesn't imagine it. It speaks his name. Now, pause here. You weren't meant to know this. These morgues, romanticized today as mere relics of Victorian science, were not just places of study. They were theaters of power, laboratories where life and death blurred, and where ancient rituals wore the disguise of medicine. The Victorians prided themselves on progress, on rationality, on science tearing down superstition. But beneath those cold stone slabs, they preserved secrets older than any empire. Do you know why corpses were never allowed to lie facing west? Why the attendants whispered to them as they stitched and sutured? Why some morgues required the dead to be counted 3 times before dawn? It wasn't superstition. It was control. The body is a doorway. The morgue is not storage. It is a temple. And the men who worked there were not merely physicians. They were gatekeepers. In every ledger you've been shown, in every sanitized history book, the morgue is described as a sterile chamber of progress. But I'm telling you now, what happened beneath Victorian hospitals was neither clean nor rational. It was ritual. It was psychological conditioning. And it was a test of whether a man could look into the silent mouth of death and not flinch when it whispered back. Listen, Seeley, because this is not a story. This is a descent. Once you step into this morgue, once you see what they did in its shadows, you cannot walk back out unchanged. Are you ready? Good. Then step into the cold with me. The morgue was never meant to be quiet, not in the way people imagine, for silence has weight, and in the Victorian era silence in such places was treated as a presence to be managed, controlled, even appeased. Attendants would hum softly while moving bodies. Surgeons whispered to cadavers before the first cut. Not out of respect, but necessity, because the belief was not that the dead were gone, but that they were listening, and listening intently, and that if you moved them without acknowledgement, they would remember the insult, follow you home, linger in the corner of your vision when the gaslight dimmed. This was no isolated superstition of unlettered men, but a practice quietly observed by some of the most celebrated physicians of the age, men whose names grace medical textbooks, men who smiled in public while muttering invocations in the basement halls of their hospitals, knowing that beneath the surface of science lurked the ancient reality that a corpse was never merely a corpse. It was an archive, a vessel, a receptacle of something you were not supposed to name. And those morgues, with their polished marble tables and copper drains, were not simply functional rooms, but constructed spaces of containment, designed with geometrical precision so that echoes of voices, yes, echoes, would linger longer than they should, words spoken in low tones vibrating against the vaulted ceilings, circling back days later like trapped spirits replaying themselves. The records do not admit this, of course. The ledgers speak only of cadaveric specimens, of dissection hours, of anatomy demonstrations. But you must ask yourself why in so many accounts the morgues were described as the echo chambers, why so many attendants left their posts trembling, reporting voices that repeated questions they never dared write down. Do you understand what this means? It means those places were desi, not merely to house the dead, but to awaken them, to amplify whatever fragment of consciousness clung to the flesh, so that young men training to be surgeons found themselves dissecting not inert tissue, but something that sighed, shifted, and sometimes, God help them, answered back. This is the part of history they buried, because once you know it, once you glimpse what those chambers were actually constructed for, you no longer see hospitals as monuments of progress, but as ritual sites dressed in white coats, and you begin to understand the real Victorian obsession was not with healing, but with command. Command over death itself, command over you, and command over the whispers that still linger in the walls of every morgue built in their image. You must picture it now, the lantern light stretching shadows across tile, slick with disinfectant, the rows of shrouded bodies lying like soldiers in surrender. Yet it was not the corpses themselves that unnerved the apprentices of medicine, but the way the room seemed to breathe with them, a cold inhalation and exhalation that made the flame tremble, though no draught could be found, and in that air the students swore they heard syllables forming, indistinct but deliberate, as if the dead themselves were rehearsing a language older than Latin, older than prayer, a language meant only for the ears of those who dared open bodies in the name of knowledge. What the textbooks never admit is that the Victorians were terrified not of decay, but of memory, for each cadaver bore the imprint of its suffering, and more than one surgeon described in private letters how the cut of his scalpel triggered visions not his own, flashes of hangings, drownings, cholera fevers, death replayed in the mind as if transferred through the very tissues under his knife, and he would stagger from the table with trembling hands, whispering that the flesh had spoken. This is why morgues were often built with windows high above the ground, not for light, but to prevent escape, to keep whatever memories awoke inside from seeping into the streets, because London in the 1860s lived on the brink of collapse. One whisper too many, and the city would have drowned in hysteria. So the institutions did what institutions always do. They contained it, wrapped it in ritual, disguised it as training, and told the young men who felt their sanity splinter that they were simply fatigued. But imagine yourself there, the weight of expectation pressing on you, the professor insisting you cut deeper while a voice behind your ear, though no one stands there, whispers your childhood nickname, a name you have not heard since your mom. There's lips first shaped it, and you feel the blood in your veins freeze because the body on your table is speaking not in words, but in identity, reaching into you, marking you, reminding you that when you touch death, death touches back. Do you understand now why these morgues were feared even by their keepers? Why attendants carried charms sewn inside their pockets? Why some never lasted more than a season before disappearing into opium dens to quiet the voices? They tell you it was science, but the truth is simpler and darker. Those rooms were built as thresholds, and the men inside them became experiments themselves, subjects in a study no one dared record, the study of whether a man could cut into the unknown and not be consumed by it. And so the deeper you descend into this world, the more you realize the morgue was never just a chamber of storage, but a crucible designed to test the will of those who entered, a place where the line between anatomy and revelation blurred until no scalpel could separate them. For once the cadavers were laid out in rows, stiff hands curled into half-fists as if clinging to the final fragments of life. The air itself became hostile, clinging, thick with more than rot. It was expectation, as though the dead anticipated recognition, and when the students leaned over with trembling fingers, knives flashing in the dim light, they were not merely cutting, they were unlocking. And what spilled from those incisions was not only fluid but history itself, voices clotted in the sinew, resentments locked in marrow, the unspeakable trauma of hundreds of lives reduced to silent archives now pried open, and the young men, unprepared, carried those fragments home, their dreams drowning in borrowed memories that were not their own, waking in the night, choking on invisible water, feeling rope burn on their necks, though no rope hung there. Some tried to laugh it off, dismissing it as the nerves of a novice, but those who endured longer came to understand a darker rhythm, that each morgue had its own personality, its own appetite, and those who served within it became gradually shaped by its hunger, as if the building itself was studying them, observing who broke first, who resisted longest, who surrendered completely, and it was whispered that professors, too, were not immune, their hands trembling imperceptibly when they thought no one watched. For the more years they gave to the dead, the more the dead seemed to claim of them in return, until their eyes hollowed, their voices cracked into whispers, and they themselves looked like revenants pacing the halls. You must realize this was not superstition alone, for records quietly confirm an unusual pattern. Dozens of dissectors found themselves raving within a decade, committed to asylums under diagnoses of melancholia or mania. Men once hailed as brilliant reduced to incoherent mutterings, their wives describing how they spoke in cadaverous tones at the dinner table as though addressing unseen guests. And always before the decline came the same symptom, a fixation on shadows that moved when no one else saw, as if every body they had once studied had followed them home and multiplied, until their own reflections turned traitor and whispered back. By now you must understand that what was taught in those morgues was never just medicine, never just the clean arithmetic of tendons and bones, but something far older, something that had been smuggled under the guise of science. For every cadaver was a door, and some doors were not meant to be opened, yet they were forced ajar by scalpels in the hands of trembling youths, and once opened, nothing ever truly closed again, because behind the muscle and cartilage there were things that could not be diagrammed, strange clots of darkness that pulsed like second hearts, networks of veins that twisted into patterns eerily resembling ancient sigils, eyes clouded in death but flickering with a light that no decomposition could explain. And the professors, though they barked orders to maintain authority, saw it too, for their sudden silences, their unexpected pauses mid-lecture, betrayed recognition of shapes they had no language for, though perhaps they once did, long ago when the art of medicine had been entwined with rites, when to heal and to conjure were not separate acts but siblings, bound by blood and necessity. And so the morgue was not merely a place of dissection, but of initiation, where each student was tested not only in skill, but in endurance against the gaze of the dead. And it was said that those who faltered, those who vomited, those who trembled too long, those who fainted, were not merely weak of constitution but rejected, cast out because the dead themselves had no use for them, while those who endured were marked. Even if they never knew it, their fates bent like softened metal, their paths redirected toward something darker than medicine, darker than knowledge itself, as if the morgue had whispered, "You belong to us now." And from that moment forward, their lives were no longer truly their own, for their patients would never just be the living, but also the unending company of those they had already disturbed, a host that followed them unseen, waiting, pressing against the edges of their perception, until at last they could no longer distinguish lecture hall from crypt, daylight from candle smoke, memory from haunting. And so the years that followed became less about study and more about survival. For though the professors still spoke of anatomy and pathology, the students began to notice that the words had hollowed, that each lecture was really a distraction meant to keep them from asking why so many cadavers had been delivered in unmarked carts at ungodly hours, why their skin was sometimes still warm, why their eyes rolled beneath lids as though dreaming, and why certain chambers in the basement were locked with iron bolts thicker than any hospital required, chambers from which the faintest murmurs seeped through the stone, not like rats or pipes, but like voices rehearsing forgotten hymns, and the students who dared press their ears against the walls returned pale, muttering of languages that had no vowels, of syllables that throbbed like wounds. And though they tried to dismiss it as fatigue, as imagination bred of candlelight and decay, a deeper recognition gnawed at them, for the rhythm of those sounds matched the strange formations of veins they had seen in their dissections, matched the odd black clots shaped like symbols, matched the faint marks some of the corpses carried like tattoos etched beneath their very flesh, and the more connections they made, the less they slept, the less they trusted the professors, until it became clear that the entire institution was not a place of healing at all, but a factory of initiation, a net cast wide across the young and hungry, dragging them into a tradition older than Hippocrates, older than Scripture, a tradition that treated the human body not as vessel of spirit, but as key, a key to doors that led downward, always downward, and those who mastered the courage to turn that key found themselves staring into corridors without end, corridors not of brick, but of bone, not of air, but of echo, corridors where the whispers of the locked chambers multiplied into a choir, a chorus of those who had been opened and could not be closed. And the greatest terror of all was not that the students would join them in death, but that they were already part of the song while still alive, voices woven in, unable to stop, unable to silence themselves even in sleep. What no one dared admit aloud, though each of them felt it pressing at the back of the skull like an infection, was that the school itself seemed to hunger, not just the men who ran it, but the walls, the halls, the bricks sweating salt at night, the beams creaking as if under the weight of invisible bodies, the staircases warping downward even though they had been measured flat the day before. And though the students tried to console one another with talk of stress and nerves, each in secret knew that his private dreams had become colonized by the same recurring image, a chamber deeper than the basement, circular, stone-slick and black, where a single figure knelt over a cadaver that was not quite human, a body too long in the limbs and too narrow in the head, with veins that shone like mercury under the torchlight, and the figure never turned its face, only whispered instructions, syllables. The dreamer woke, remembering in fragments that when written down matched perfectly the blotched marks found on corpses delivered by those midnight carts, a language older than the school, older than the country itself, older perhaps than the species who studied it. And as they pieced these shreds together, the students realized that their learning was no longer about disease or anatomy, but about transmission. Not knowledge from teacher to pupil, but from the dead to the living. And each lesson absorbed left them weaker, paler, yet more attuned, until a strange reversal began. Their professors seemed to age in reverse, lines softening, eyes brightening, while the students, though in their 20s, began to look like men twice that age, as if whatever bargain the school had struck was siphoning the vigor of one group to nourish another, and still none could leave, for letters home were never answered. And when one young man packed his trunk and fled on horseback, the next morning his mare trotted back through the gates, the saddle empty, the reins dragging, the leather wet not with rain, but with something darker, something the soil refused to drink, and the faculty only smiled, reminding the others that true medicine demanded sacrifice, that progress was not free, that to cure the world one must first bleed for it. But in the stillness of night, the students understood the lie, that it was not the world being cured at all, but the walls, the halls, the very bones of the school itself being fed with flesh, time, and memory, until it grew into something more than stone, something that could not be dismantled, for to tear it down would be to tear down the men themselves, who by then no longer knew where their bodies ended and the structure began. It was during the second winter that the whispers turned into something else, no longer confined to the dreams of the students, but seeping into the air itself, a vibration felt in the chest more than heard, a low thrum that seemed to pulse from beneath the flagstones of the assembly hall. And when the snow lay thickest on the roof and the river froze solid, the students noticed the school growing warm, as though the stone itself carried a fever, corridors steaming faintly with breath, even though no one stood there, and the lantern flames bending in strange directions, as if pulled by currents invisible to the eye. And with this came the rituals, though never called such, masked instead as examinations, where the pupils were ushered in small groups to the cadaver room and instructed to place their hands on the chest of the specimen, not to cut, not to measure, simply to touch. And as they did so, every boy swore he felt a faint rise and fall, the rhythm of lungs that should not have drawn breath, a heartbeat fluttering just beneath gray skin, and yet the professors demanded stillness, silence, reverence, as though kneeling in a chapel, until one student, overcome, vomited onto the tiles and begged forgiveness, but the faculty only smiled, writing furiously in their ledgers, And when that boy did not return to his quarters that night, no one dared to inquire, for his bed was stripped bare before morning, and his name omitted from the roster, as though he had never walked those halls at all. Soon the rest learned the unspoken truth, that survival depended not on resistance, but submission, that the school thrived not by the excellence of its teaching, but by the obedience of its offerings, and each missing face became a warning etched deeper into their marrow, teaching them that rebellion was not punished but erased, and in that erasure lay the greatest horror, the realization that memory itself could be devoured, that even one's past could be fed into the hungry bones of the building until not even grief remained, only the endless vibration in the chest, calling, summoning, promising that the walls had need of more. By the spring thaw, when the ice broke apart on the river, like glass splintering in slow motion, the remaining students had begun to understand that the seminary was not a place of learning, but a vessel, a container built to house something older than Scripture, older than the land itself, and though none could articulate it, each felt the truth pressing down on them whenever they lay in bed, and heard the walls creak with a cadence too regular to be wood-settling, a pulse echoing through the beams, as if the building possessed a circulatory system of its own, feeding on them, and what unnerved them most was not the missing pupils, but the professors, who had grown gaunter, their eyes sunk into sockets, yet burning brighter with every disappearance, as though each lost boy bled vitality into their veins. And when one dared to whisper this thought aloud, suggesting the faculty were not scholars, but custodians, tending to something unspeakable, he was struck silent by a force that seemed to clutch his throat mid-word, a choking that left him clawing at the air until his lips purpled and he collapsed, his breath restored only when the headmaster raised a single hand as if to release him, and no one dared speak speculation again. Instead, the students adapted, adopting a rigid politeness, bowing slightly in the corridors, keeping their eyes lowered, but still the seminary reached for them in subtler ways. Sometimes in the library, a book would fall open on its own, to a page scrawled with words in no language known, yet each boy who stared too long claimed he began to understand it, not by translation, but by infection, the meaning leaking into his thoughts until he recoiled, trembling, from the implication that the text had been written not for mankind at all, but for the stones and the shadows, instructions for the very walls to obey, and by then every remaining student had a private knowledge they could never voice, that the seminary was a threshold, and each lesson, each ritual, each disappearance was less about teaching and more about shaping them into something that would fit whatever waited beyond the threshold's door. By midsummer, the seminary's air grew so thick with heat and mildew that the boys often woke drenched, though the stone walls should have kept it cool, and it was in that suffocating season that the true nature of their captivity revealed itself, not through a grand proclamation or discovery, but through the small, almost accidental unveiling of a hidden corridor, when one of the younger boys, delirious from fever, pressed against a panel in the chapel, and it swung open to reveal stairs plunging into earth where no foundation ought to be, and the descent carried with it a smell of copper and wet soil, the kind that clings to a battlefield or freshly turned grave, and the few who dared follow him down carried candles that bent and warped in their flames as though repelled by something unseen. But even before they reached the bottom, they heard it, the hum, low at first, but growing louder until it vibrated in their bones like the resonance of a massive organ pipe. And when they stumbled upon the chamber itself, its walls slick and veined with roots that seemed to pulse in unison with the hum, they saw the missing students, or what had been students, strung along the walls, suspended in niches as though the building itself had grown pockets to hold them, their eyes open but vacant, their mouths twitching silently, reciting words the living could not catch. And before terror could rip them back up the stairs, a voice, not booming, not external, but intimately inside their skulls, whispered that these were not victims but vessels, that each disappearance was not theft but preparation. And as their candles sputtered out one by one, leaving them in blackness except for the faint phosphorescent glow of the walls themselves, the voice continued, soft and persuasive, telling them that their own turn was inevitable, that the seminary was not built as a place of teaching at all, but as an altar, a harvest ground where youth, faith, and fear were offerings feeding something that predated the Bible itself, something that had been promised worship long before the first stones of this so-called school were laid. And though the boys fled up the stairs, half mad and blinded by terror, they carried with them not only the memory of that chamber, but the knowledge that survival was no longer a matter of escape. For once the seminary had chosen you, it lived in you, and the more you tried to resist, the more it shaped you into what it wanted. From that night forward, the seminary's halls no longer felt merely oppressive. They felt watchful, as if the very stones remembered who had stepped into that subterranean chamber, and the boys who had seen it found themselves unable to sleep, their dreams stitched with images of walls breathing, roots curling like veins through flesh, and mouths moving in silence. And though they tried to confide in the others, their words came out broken, scattered, as though some unseen hand was rearranging their thoughts before they could speak them. So the rest began to view them as touched, unstable, possessed even. And in this suspicion the seminary found its power deepening, because now it was not merely the priests who enforced silence, but the students themselves, each watching the other for signs of corruption, and punishments no longer required formal whippings or prayers. Suspicion alone was enough to exile a boy to the infirmary, from which few returned, and those who did seemed altered, their eyes glassy, their skin pale as if drained of something invisible but essential. And with every passing week, the seminary ate away not only at their bodies, but at their very sense of time. For days bled into nights without measure, bells rang out of sequence, meals were served at hours no clock would confirm, until the boys whispered that the world beyond the seminary might no longer exist, that they were suspended in a pocket of unbroken hours designed for one purpose alone: to prepare them for the descent, to ready them to take their place in the niches below. And the thought clawed at their sanity until some began to believe that madness itself might be their only escape, for while the seminary devoured the obedient, the mad might slip through its grasp, unfit for sacrifice, and so whispers of self-inflicted frenzy spread like wildfire in the dormitories, and in the candlelight I would scratch their own skin, murmur in invented tongues, roll their eyes into the whites, anything to appear touched by forces beyond the seminary's control. But the building seemed to know, for madness too was absorbed into its hunger, and those who feigned it soon became it, their pretenses swallowed until they no longer remembered they had ever acted, leaving the others to wonder if the seminary itself had designed the plan, if it had planted the thought in their minds only to watch them unravel. And so the lines between actor and victim blurred, between willing and unwilling offerings, until all that remained was the slow, inexorable awareness that no matter what mask they wore, their fate was already sealed. By the winter of that cursed year, when snow clung to the seminary's eaves like pale shrouds, the boys no longer trusted the measure of their own senses. For corridors they swore they had walked for months now, bent into unfamiliar turns, staircases lengthened in the middle of the night as though the building itself were stretching, and doors that had once led to dormitories opened instead into storage rooms, filled with rusted instruments of unknown purpose. And though some whispered that the priests moved things around deliberately to break their grip on reality, others muttered something far worse, that the seminary was not merely stone and wood, but a living edifice, reshaping itself in answer to their fear, that its foundations were a mouth and its walls a rib cage, and they were trapped inside something vast and breathing. Each creak of the timber sounded not like strain, but like a sigh, each gust of wind down the chimney like a moan, until the boys began to mark their skin with scratches, desperate proof that they still existed as more than echoes. And yet even these marks sometimes healed overnight, vanishing as though rewritten by unseen hands, leaving them to wonder if they had ever wounded themselves at all, or if the seminary had only lent them the illusion of suffering before reclaiming it. Meals became another theater of horror, bowls of stew arriving lukewarm and gray, the meat stringy and sour. But worse than the taste was the gnawing suspicion that it was not stew at all, that perhaps the seminary had no kitchens, that the food itself was conjured or carved from some secret source below, and though none dared say it aloud, the thought slithered through their minds, that they were being made to eat the seminary, to take it into themselves so that they would not merely live within its body, but become extensions of it, flesh threaded into stone, boys into pill, arse, thoughts into echoes. And if that was true, then escape was no longer a matter of walls or gates, for the seminary was not holding them inside, it was drawing them inward, drawing them down, and the more they resisted, the closer they came to the certainty that their very bones were being catalogued, aligned for some grim symmetry in the dark below, a design only the seminary itself could understand. The first disappearance came without warning, though in truth it was less a vanishing than a quiet erasure. For one night during prayers, a boy named Samuel Harper, tall, freckled, and known for humming hymns beneath his breath to steady himself, simply did not rise with the others from his knees, his head bent low as if in reverence, until the boy beside him nudged his shoulder and his body toppled like an emptied sack. The face drained of all color, eyes open but vacant, mouth parted as though he had been trying to speak some last word. Yet when the priests carried him away and returned with whispers of illness and fever, the boys knew better, for Samuel's lips were cracked with dryness, as if he had been parched for weeks, though he had drunk water that very morning. His fingertips curled as if clawing at something none could see, and in the days that followed, the other boys noticed strange absences, not only of him, but of memory itself, for they struggled to recall his laugh, his voice, even his exact features, as though the seminary were not content with consuming the boy's body, but had reached back into the minds of the living to strip away the threads that bound him to them. When they gathered at night in trembling circles to whisper about him, they found themselves stumbling over his name, unable to speak it aloud without their tongues faltering, and the more they tried to hold him in thought, the quicker he slipped from their grasp, until even his closest companion awoke one dawn insisting there had never been a Samuel among them, that the bed they swore had once been his had always been empty, and though the others argued, they felt their certainty eroding, a tide pulling away what little they clung to, leaving behind only a gnawing awareness that something had been taken from them, not by death alone, but by a force determined to blot out every trace of the boy's existence. And as the nights deepened, they realized the horror was not merely that Samuel was gone, but that the seminary had chosen him, that it would choose again, and that each name they whispered might soon dissolve into silence until none of them remained but the building itself, a husk filled with faint echoes of laughter, prayers, and screams, all belonging to children who were no longer remembered by anyone beyond its doors. In the weeks that followed Samuel's erasure, the boys' nerves, frayed like threads pulled too thin, every glance weighted with suspicion, every silence louder than words. For they began to fear not only the seminary, but one another, convinced that the disappearances were not random, but chosen, and that someone among them had drawn the eye of whatever power fed on their number. The friendships that had once been lifelines, shared bread, whispered prayers in the dark, curdled into brittle truces, broken by sudden accusations when a boy failed to remember a detail or spoke too softly in the night, and one bitter evening a scuffle broke out in the dormitory, fists thrown not from anger but from desperation, the boys demanding to know who among them had called Samuel forth to the thing that waited in the shadows. Yet even as they fought, some part of them knew the truth, that there was no traitor, that the seminary itself was the hand plucking them away, feeding off their fear and planting seeds of doubt so they would destroy themselves before it had to lift another finger. And still they clung to the illusion of blame because it was easier to accuse a living face than admit they were trapped in a place whose very stones had teeth. At meals they began to count heads obsessively, their lips moving silently as they checked and rechecked that the number matched the night before. Though even this offered no comfort, for memory faltered, boys swearing there had once been 30, others insisting 29. The argument rising like fire until the priests banged their canes on the floor, demanding silence, and the boys fell quiet, not out of obedience, but terror. For each sharp crack of wood against stone reminded them how easily flesh could be broken. Sleep became a battleground, too, every creak of timber or whisper of wind sounding like footsteps, and some took to binding themselves together with scraps of cloth torn from their sheets, thinking that if one were taken, the others might feel the tug and hold him fast. Yet morning always revealed loosened knots, slack ties, and the same hollow dread that the seminary would always find a way, for it needed no doors or windows, only silence and forgetfulness, and already the boys could feel themselves slipping toward both. It was not long before the first whispers began, faint at first, no louder than the wind sighing through a crack in the wall, yet unmistakably carrying Samuel's voice, a fragile murmur that threaded itself through the stone corridors and pooled in the ears of those who dared listen, saying their names, pleading, sometimes laughing in a broken way that did not sound like the boy they remembered. And though none spoke of it openly, each knew they were not alone in hearing it, for at night they would catch each other staring toward the same shadowed corners, heads cocked as though straining for a sound that could not be admitted. Some tried to smother it with hymns, chanting prayers under their breath until their voices cracked, but the murmurs only bent around the words, weaving through the prayers like mockery, while others covered their ears with their hands, pressing until their heads ached, though the voice was not bound by flesh, seeping through their skulls as if the stone itself had learned to speak. What chilled them most was how Samuel's voice shifted, at times sounding desperate, begging to be let back in, at others sly, warning that those who ignored him would vanish next, and once, in the dead of night, every boy in the dormitory awoke at once to hear it whisper the exact same phrase in perfect unison, "Do you remember me?" A question that sliced through them like a blade, for already his face was blurring in memory, features smudged like paint left out in rain, until they could no longer recall the color of his hair or the sound of his laugh, only the certainty that he had existed and the shameful suspicion that perhaps he never had. The priests, when confronted, sneered at their claims, calling them tricks of imagination, and yet the boys saw the fear flash, quick and unguarded, in the old men's eyes before the mask dropped back into place, confirming what? They already suspected, that Samuel was not lost, not dead, but absorbed into the seminary itself, his voice nothing but the first echo of many, and each boy now knew in the marrow of his bones that soon it would be his own name carried on the walls, asking the same question, while his body vanished into silence. The first to break was Thomas Hale, a boy with a restless stare, who had spent nights rocking himself in silence, clutching his blanket as if it were the last thing tethering him to sanity, until one evening, when the murmurs grew unbearably loud, and Samuel's voice pressed so close to his ear it felt like warm breath against his skin, he whispered back into the dark, "Yes, I remember you," his words trembling, barely audible, but the moment they left his lips, the room seemed to shift, the air compressing as though the stone walls leaned closer to listen, and for a long stretch of seconds, nothing followed, only silence so deep it rang in their bones, until Samuel's voice returned, no longer scattered and ghost-like but clear, resonant, as though he were standing in the center of the dormitory. "Then you will come with me." And before anyone could move, Thomas rose from his cot, his eyes glassy and unseeing, his body moving with a mechanical obedience, his bare feet slapping the cold floor as he walked toward the far wall, not the door, not the exit, but the stone itself, and though the others called his name, pulling at his arms, they could not hold him, for he slipped through their grasp with unnatural strength, pressing his palms flat against the wall until, impossibly, his hands sank through the stone as if it were water, followed by his shoulders, his chest, his head, until with one final shudder he vanished, leaving only the impression of heat on the stone where he had passed, and the dormitory fell into a silence more suffocating than the voice itself. Some boys wept, others knelt in frantic prayer, but most sat frozen, staring at the wall where their companion had disappeared, knowing that the seminary was not merely haunted, but hungry, that it fed on them one by one, using Samuel as its lure, and the unspoken terror between them was not that Thomas had been taken, it was that he had answered, and something had answered back. After Thomas's disappearance, the boys tried to cling to silence, believing that if they ignored the voice it might lose interest. But Samuel was patient, his whispers becoming more deliberate, more personal, curling into their ears at night, with details no one should have known, secrets whispered to a mother long dead, sins confessed in the confessional booth, memories of childhood moments they had never shared aloud. And when he spoke a name, it came not as a suggestion, but as a command, a slow, inexorable pulling that began in the marrow of the bones and spread outward until the body was no longer its own. The first nights after Thomas, the boys resisted, holding hands in the dark, forcing themselves awake. Yet, inevitably, one by one, their strength faltered, their eyelids heavy, their resolve buckling, and the moment they drifted, Samuel's voice surged in, claiming them, calling them forward, as if the seminary itself had drawn lots and decided who would be next. Matthew was the second, torn from his cot with a scream that ended mid-breath as though swallowed by the wall. And then Peter vanished without a sound, leaving his bed still warm. By the fourth and fifth, the boys no longer even cried out for help, for they knew no prayer, no physical resistance, no adult intervention could save them, that the building itself had joined in Samuel's hunger, the stones vibrating with a low groan whenever one was taken, as if exhaling satisfaction after a meal, and the survivors, shrunken to fewer and fewer, began to mark the nights in dread rather than sleep, staring at the shadowed corners, waiting for their name, their turn, their undoing, the certainty growing with every hour that the seminary was not merely possessed, but orchestrated, a theater of devouring where Samuel was both actor and script, and they were only the lines waiting to be spoken. By the time only a handful of boys remained, desperation had stripped them of innocence and left them raw, trembling creatures who understood that waiting meant death, so they resolved in whispers to turn the seminary's hunger back upon itself, to outlast Samuel by binding themselves together in vigil, refusing to sleep, refusing to listen, refusing to grant the voice even a crack through which it might slip. But the seminary did not tolerate defiance, and the night they made their pact, the building seemed to awaken in full. The rafters groaned like ribs bending under strain, doors slammed of their own accord, and the crucifix above the chapel shuddered and fell with a thunderous crash, as though Christ himself had abandoned the fight. Yet still they clung to one another, hands knotted in a circle, nails digging into flesh to keep themselves awake, murmuring psalms they barely remembered. But Samuel's laughter slithered through their chants like oil over water, taunting them with promises that resistance only sweetened the taste. And soon the air itself grew heavy, rank with the scent of damp earth and rot, pressing down on their lungs until breath came shallow and ragged, while the candles guttered and died one by one, though no wind stirred. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing across the floorboards, though no body cast a shadow. And the boys, shaking, realized that Samuel had no need to wait for their surrender, that he had grown strong enough to enter waking hours, to manifest without dream, and when the first of their circle screamed, the others tightened their grip, but his chair jerked backward as if hooked by an invisible claw, and his nails tore bloody trails in their palms as he was wrenched into the dark, their ring broken, their defense shattered, leaving the survivors choking on terror as they understood that fighting back had not delayed the inevitable but accelerated it, granting Samuel the strength he had craved all along. The collapse of their fragile unity marked the seminary's final feast, for with the circle broken, the boys were no longer defenders, but prey scattered in the wolf's den, each clutching his crucifix or Bible as if paper and wood could stem the tide of a force older than their faith. And in that blackness thick as tar, Samuel revealed himself not as a shadow slipping between rafters, but as a body wrought of absence, a figure shaped like a man yet too tall, his limbs bending at impossible angles, his head lolling as though it were hung on strings. And where his face should have been was only a blur of motion, a storm of mouths whispering in overlapping tones, some crying, some laughing, some calling each boy by name with the tender cadence of their mothers, a mockery so intimate it froze them in place. The last survivors huddled at the far end of the chapel, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and cold, yet unable to look away as the creature lurched toward them, dragging behind it the echoes of every death that had already taken place within those walls. Every scream layered into its being, every prayer consumed, until the seminary itself seemed nothing more than his skeleton, every beam and corridor nothing more than his ribs and veins. And the boys understood too late that Samuel was no longer a ghost bound to a house, but a house made flesh, a living architecture of horror that would never release them. When he stretched out his arm, an arm that stretched and stretched until it filled their sight, one boy fainted on the spot, another clawed his own face bloody, trying not to see, and the last, the youngest, only whispered, "Father, forgive us," as the blackness poured over them like water through cracks, swallowing their cries, silencing their hearts, erasing their names from the earth until not even the memory of their pact remained, only the echo of a seminary whose stones breathed in time with the nightmare it had birthed. When at last the seminary fell silent, its silence was not the peace of an empty building, but the oppressive quiet of a tomb freshly sealed. And for weeks the hilltop remained untouched, for the townspeople who had once eyed the seminary with cautious respect now crossed themselves when they passed it, whispering that no boy who had entered those gates had been seen again, until finally, driven by duty or perhaps morbid curiosity, a delegation of men from the parish and the county sheriff rode up the gravel path with lanterns in hand, their horses skittish and sweating despite the cool spring air. And what they found upon entering the chapel was a scene that no earthly law could categorize, for there were no bodies, no blood, no signs of violence at all, only rows of overturned pews, as though scattered in panic, prayer books shredded into thin strips that drifted like dead leaves across the floor, and on the pulpit, carved deep into the oak, as if by a hand that was not human, was a single phrase in Latin, Adversus filios Dei, domus facta caro, which loosely translated meant, Against the sons of God, the house has become flesh, words so blasphemous that the priest who read them out loud spat on the floor and refused to stay another moment within the walls. And yet the sheriff pressed further, opening doors that led to dormitories, kitchens, and storage rooms, each one abandoned, the beds neatly made, meals still half prepared as though the boys had vanished mid-gesture, their forks resting on plates, bread hardened to stone, and cups still stained with wine. In the far corner of the basement, however, they found something stranger still, a crude outline on the stone wall, drawn in what looked like charcoal, but was oily to the touch, and within that outline was the imprint of hands pressed outward, not one or two, but dozens, as if the missing boys had been absorbed to the wall itself, their final act a desperate push against the very structure that consumed them. And though the sheriff ordered the building locked and guarded, the men who stood watch never lasted more than a night, reporting the sound of boys laughing in the rafters, the weight of unseen footsteps pressing on the stairs, and in one chilling account, the priest swore that as dawn broke, he saw the seminary breathe, its roof expanding and contracting like the chest of a sleeping beast. And he knew then that the building was not deserted, but waiting, as patient as hunger, for its next offering. What followed was not an investigation in any true sense, but a suffocation of truth, for within days officials from the diocese arrived with sealed letters and wax stamps, and the sheriff who had first dared to speak of the wall of hands was suddenly quiet, his reports locked away, his testimony reduced to rumor, while townsfolk who whispered of the seminary's hunger were visited in the night by stern-faced clergy urging silence for the sake of the faith. And so the disappearance of 15 boys was recast as a tragic outbreak of fever that swept through the hilltop and required immediate quarantine. Though not a single body was ever buried, no graves marked, no coffins lowered into the earth. Instead, wagons covered in black canvas were seen rumbling away from the seminary at dusk, driven by men no one recognized, their wheels leaving tracks that vanished into the forest. And when asked where the boys had been taken, the church replied only with vague scripture about returning to God that which he has claimed, a phrase that left more dread than comfort, and soon any who pressed further found themselves ostracized, denied communion, their businesses mysteriously failing, their children turned away from parish schools, until even the boldest among them bowed their heads and agreed never to speak of the seminary again. But silence, as history has proven again and again, is never the same as erasure, for in the hidden spaces of town, behind tavern doors, in the kitchens of widows who had lost their sons, stories fermented like wine, growing darker with each retelling, that the church had not simply covered up an accident, but had fed the seminary itself, offering it the boys as sacrifice to keep something older and more dangerous from waking. And whether these whispers were superstition or revelation hardly mattered, for the effect was the same. The seminary remained, locked, its windows barred, its grounds avoided, and in time, official records ceased to mention it at all, as if the building had never existed, as if the boys had never lived. But the stone walls still stood on that hill, watching, waiting, breathing in the shadows, a monument not to faith, but to the power of institutions to turn absence into silence and silence into control. Yet legends have a way of outgrowing the cages that institutions build for them, and though the seminary was sealed, though official records buried it beneath euphemisms and parish lies, the story leaked into border towns and eventually into the writings of itinerant preachers and traveling mystics who came to Kentucky seeking proof of devils and miracles, men who scrawled feverish accounts in their journals of a house of God with a hollow core, where prayers echoed but never returned. And soon whispers of the hilltop spread along trade roads and river routes, attracting not just the curious, but the hungry. Occultists who believed the seminary was less a school and more a gate, a vestibule into a chamber where heaven and hell met, a place where the flesh of the innocent was required to prop open a door the church dared not fully close. They came at night, hooded and nameless, to circle its iron gates, leaving bones and black candles as offerings, testing the air for signs of what remained, while rival sects in the region, those branded heretics by Rome and left to fester in secrecy, claimed the seminary was proof of what they had long preached, that the institution of the church was not a guardian of light, but the keeper of chains, holding back something not divine, but monstrous. And they pointed to the missing boys as evidence that power demanded sacrifice, always sacrifice, whether draped in ritual or disguised as fever and plague. And so the seminary became two things at once, depending on who told the tale. To the faithful, it was a site of tragedy that must be forgotten, a scar best hidden beneath robes of silence. But to the seekers of forbidden knowledge, it became a beacon, a magnet, a cursed reliquary whispering promises of revelation to anyone willing to trespass its rotting halls. And by the 1850s, travelers spoke of torchlight seen inside its windows, long after it was abandoned, of hymns sung backward at midnight, of scratching hands pressed against the glass as if the boys were still trapped inside, neither alive nor gone, suspended in some cruel covenant that the church could never fully sever, only deny. It was in the spring of 1853 when the first trespassers forced their way into the seminary, two brothers from a river town not 20 miles south, sons of a carpenter who had grown up hearing their father mutter drunkenly about the night the bells tolled without hands pulling them, about the priests who had gone pale and silent when asked where the boys had gone, And the brothers, emboldened by whiskey and the thrill of legend, took lanterns and crowbars and pried open a side door swollen with rot, stepping into a silence so thick it made the air seem solid, as though the building itself had been holding its breath since the day the church abandoned it. And what they found inside was not the stripped, looted husk they expected, but a space that felt arranged, curated almost, as though someone or something had been tending to it in the dark. Pews still aligned in rigid rows, hymnals stacked neatly, though their pages were wet with mildew. Crucifixes hanging, yet their faces eroded smooth, as if licked away by unseen tongues. And in the chapel's center, beneath a pulpit cracked from lightning strike, lay 13 pairs of children's shoes, arranged heel to toe in a perfect circle, each one blackened as though scorched, though there was no mark of fire anywhere else. The brothers swore they heard movement above them, faint at first and then unmistakable, the shuffling of bare feet across wooden floors, a slow pacing overhead that quickened the longer they stayed. And though they tried to call out, their voices were swallowed, their words vanishing into the rafters like drops of water into dry earth. And one brother claimed the lantern dimmed, not because the flame weakened, but because the light itself was being pulled away, drained toward the circle of shoes, as though memory itself was feeding on it. When they fled, stumbling back into the night, they told no one at first, for Hay feared laughter, but within weeks both were seen wandering town streets at night, their faces hollow, muttering the same phrase over and over. They're still singing, but not for God. And though their families locked them in, though ministers tried to pray over them, both brothers were found drowned in the Ohio River a month later, their bodies clasping one another as if they had walked willingly into the current, and when their pockets were searched, each carried a single small child's shoe, blackened and brittle, as if carried out of the seminary against their will. The brothers' deaths should have been enough to deter anyone from stepping near the seminary again, but human curiosity is a disease that festers most violently when wrapped in silence, and by the 1860s, when the war had bled Kentucky of its sons and filled its fields with graves, deserters, drifters, and soldiers fleeing conscription found themselves drawn to the abandoned place, not out of reverence, but out of desperation, for the seminary had become a landmark whispered of in taverns as a shelter where no sheriff would follow and no bounty hunter would linger. And though some men claimed to sleep within its walls without incident, others emerged broken, stammering like children, refusing to enter sunlight, insisting they could still hear prayers whispered backwards in the rafters. And always the story circled back to the children. The drowned voices of choirs humming through the night air, the faint padding of small feet on staircases that collapsed decades earlier, the sensation of being watched not by something hateful, but by something hungry, patient, and unresolved. And then, when the war finally ended and the country staggered toward some parody of peace, the church itself returned to Kentucky, not with priests or blessings, but with masons and ledgers, men tasked with erasing, men who spoke in clipped tones about reclamation and sanctification, yet carried no crosses, only chisels and lime. And they began pulling the seminary apart stone by stone, though witnesses swore that the walls seemed to resist, that every block removed left another block behind, as though the building replenished itself when no one was looking. And more than once, a laborer's scream pierced the morning when a hand slipped or a rope snapped, and their bodies were lowered to the ground, not broken but stiff as wax, mouths gaping, eyes coated in a film of white that no doctor could name. And by the third death, the masons abandoned their work entirely, claiming the structure did not want to die, and so it remained, half dismantled yet whole, a scar on the Kentucky landscape, a place everyone pretended had been demolished but which still stood, its shadow falling longer each year, its silence becoming its own form of scripture. And yet the seminary's hunger did not rest simply with wanderers or laborers. It began to extend its reach into the living settlements around it, quiet farmsteads that dotted the Kentucky ridges within a few miles of its shadow, and by 1872 records begin to whisper of families who simply ceased. their cabins left half-swept, porridge still cooling on the hearthstone, doors ajar as if they had stepped out to greet someone and never returned, and neighbors spoke of seeing lights on the abandoned hill the night before, faint lantern glows bobbing in patterns too precise to be aimless, as though some forgotten service was still being conducted within its halls. But when search parties gathered, they found only the buildings as they always had been, roof sagging, windows like eye sockets, doors nailed shut decades before, and yet, in the soil around the threshold, prints were discovered, not of boots or bare feet, but of something too small and too narrow, children's tracks, dozens of them pressed deep, as if the ground itself had softened to take their weight. And when one of the searchers dared to touch the iron handle of the great oak door, he claimed it pulsed like flesh beneath his hand, and for weeks afterward he carried a tremor in his arm that never left him, shaking so violently by winter that he could no longer guide a plow, forcing his family to sell their land, and from then on the phrase "seminary families" entered Kentucky folklore, a grim shorthand for households that vanished without quarrel, feud, or sign of robbery, as though they had been summoned, collected, absorbed by the building's unfinished liturgy, and so silence grew again. For though farmers would lower their voices and point their chins toward the ridge, no one dared ride up after dark, and the county clerks grew tired of filing missing person reports that no sheriff could chase, until finally it was, as agreed upon, though never written, that the seminary was not to be named in official record, not to be mapped, not to be spoken of in open court, a place left to rot in rumor, though it never rotted, for wood that should have collapsed into mulch remained stubborn, and stone that should have cracked in the frost stayed whole, as though the absence of its congregation had only made it more alive. By the time a new generation of fortune hunters and self-styled scholars turned their attention to the seminary in the late 1870s, the stories of vanishing families and phantom services had already curdled into a kind of forbidden lure, drawing men who believed that within those hollow halls lay not tragedy, but treasure. Gold, hidden by the founders, relics smuggled from Europe, or grimoires that could command wealth and loyalty. And so they arrived from Louisville, from St. Louis, even from New Orleans, men with lanterns, spades, rifles, and more ambition than sense. And though they entered with bluster and the confidence of the educated or the well-armed, the reports that trickled back, usually from one survivor who stumbled out after days missing, told a different tale. They spoke of hearing voices in the dark, chanting in a language that was not Latin, yet bore its cadences, of walls that breathed fog like lungs, of staircases that stretched farther upward the longer they climbed, as if the seminary grew a new floor in defiance of their measure and of being separated from their companions, though they swore they never took a turn, only to find their lantern light swallowed by an invisible curtain, leaving them alone with the sound of children's laughter rising up from the floors beneath. Some spoke of relics, yes, blackened chalices that burned the skin, books whose letters crawled like insects before vanishing into the paper. But those who tried to carry such things out never reached the tree line, their bodies later found gnawed down to bone by something that left no tracks. And so word spread among the clandestine societies of the time that the seminary was no ruin at all, but an active site, a node where history and hunger converged, and as such it should not be looted, but venerated, guarded, perhaps even worshipped. And from there arose the whispered rumors that at least 3 secret orders made pilgrimages to its doors under cover of moonless nights, not to rob it, but to feed it, to offer livestock, vagrants, or worse, believing that, in exchange, they received influence, knowledge, or the certainty that their enemies would vanish as silently as the families of the nearby hills. And thus the seminary crossed a new threshold in its infamy, no longer feared only as a cursed remnant of the past, but courted as a partner in dark commerce, a silent church whose liturgy was still ongoing, its congregation hidden, its altar never truly cold. The locals, who had long ago learned to live with the seminary as one might live beside a swamp or a cliff, something dangerous but predictable if left undisturbed, began to notice in those same years that the old road leading up to its hilltop showed new tracks at dawn. Wagon ruts cut deep into the mud, though no caravan was ever seen traveling by daylight, and farmers swore they heard iron wheels creak past their fields just before the rooster crowed, accompanied not by conversation but by a low, droning chant that carried on the wind like bees in a hive. And then came the disappearances again. But these were different from the old tragedies. This time it was not entire families vanishing in a single night, but solitary wanderers, a hired hand who left town after payday, a farm wife's brother who came visiting from Lexington and never returned, a tinker who traveled those roads with bolts of cloth and copperware, each gone without trace, their last known step recorded near the Seminary Hill. And soon the sheriff's men attempted a search, only to return within an hour, pale and shaking, muttering that the woods themselves had closed in like a cage, branches knotting above and brambles curling underfoot, as though the earth had decided to protect the structure, and from then on the law stopped trying, claiming the missing must have simply fled debts or chosen another road west, though the widows and mothers knew better, for they woke at night to see, from their cabin windows, lanterns moving in procession toward the seminary gates, not carried by men on foot, but floating low and silent as if guided by unseen hands, disappearing into the trees, with a patience too measured to be anything but ritual. And so the people began to tell their children in whispers that the seminary was no longer abandoned at all, but had taken on new keepers, men who wore no uniform and claimed no pariah. Men who called no roll and swore no oath to the town, but who nonetheless gathered faithfully in that ruin to offer something, whether prayer or sacrifice none dared to say. And in return, the seminary gave them secrecy and perhaps power, for it was noted that those who traveled with these silent processions, strangers in carriages or men cloaked against the night, were later spoken of in far-off cities as newly risen in wealth, in station, or in influence, while their names disappeared from every record in Kentucky, as though the seminary had swallowed their past as payment for their future. What unsettled the few who still dared whisper about it was not only that the seminary seemed to consume the forgotten, but that its influence began to bleed outward into the living fabric of Kentucky itself. For within a decade of those silent processions beginning, men of peculiar fortune began appearing in courthouses and banks, men whose accents betrayed no origin, whose genealogies dissolved when traced, yet who spoke with such confidence and carried such sudden wealth that no one questioned their authority. And these men, always pale, always severe, always carrying on their person some token of blackened wood or tarnished brass, were rumored to have emerged from the seminary gates one dawn and ridden west as though anointed. And from that day forward contracts bent in their favor. Juries obeyed them without hesitation, and property lines blurred until entire tracts of land shifted mysteriously into their estates, which grew vast and untouchable, and those who opposed them found their children falling sick, their crops withering, their barns collapsing under fire or storm with unnatural timing, until resistance itself seemed an act of suicide, and so the townspeople adopted the only form of protection they could: silence, a silence so thick that even within families no one dared name the seminary aloud, though every heart carried the knowledge that the ruin had become something far more dangerous than abandoned stone. It had become a kind of womb for power, birthing men who stepped into the world as if sculpted by unseen hands. And yet this power was not without a price, for occasionally one of these figures, years after ascending to wealth and station, would be found in some distant city lodging, clawing at their own skin, screaming of voices that never ceased, begging to be taken back to the hill, and before any physician could sedate them, their bodies would shrivel in a single night, as though the flesh itself had been leached of vitality, leaving behind husks that bore the unmistakable scent of earth and iron, the smell, said those few brave enough to describe it, of the seminary's crypt-like halls, as if the ruin itself reached across miles to reclaim what belonged to it. The processions, it was later whispered in the most secretive corners of taverns and in letters that never dared to carry signatures, were not merely nocturnal wanderings of deranged souls but deliberate rites, and those few who claimed to have hidden near the seminary's crumbling windows spoke of seeing figures robed not in any clerical garb known to the church, but in garments woven from funeral shrouds, stitched crudely with threads darkened by soot and blood, their faces obscured by masks carved from wood so blackened it seemed burned. And within the great collapsed chapel they formed circles around objects that defied reason. Altars not of stone but of bone bound together with wire, chalices filled not with wine but with a thick glistening fluid that caught the moonlight in colors no eye should witness. And in the center, on certain nights when the air itself seemed to shudder, was laid a figure too rigid to be alive yet too restless to be entirely dead. The townsfolk called it the bride, though no one could say why, only that the chanting would rise until the walls themselves seemed to shake, and with a sudden, unnatural silence, the figure's eyes would open, blazing with a sickly yellow light, before every candle was snuffed by an unseen force, and the watchers outside fled in terror, though the sound of something wet dragging across the chapel floor pursued them long into the hills, and from that night onward, livestock in the valley would be found mutilated, carved with symbols matching those scrawled on the seminary's doors, as if the rites were not meant to remain within the ruin, but to spill into the land itself, seeding it with a corruption that could never be cleansed, a corruption that chained the community in perpetual dread, for they knew, though none would confess it aloud, that those who joined the processions were not always the same as those who returned, that faces changed subtly, eyes gleamed too brightly, voices carried tones not their own, and so the question gnawed at every survivor's mind, were the neighbors they passed in daylight still their neighbors at all, or had the seminary already remade them into vessels for something far older, something that wore human skin only as disguise? The bride became less a rumor and more a presence, for even when she was not seen, her shadow seemed to stretch across the valley, a weight pressing down on the living, and those who once dismissed the tales as superstition found themselves waking in the night to the faint rustle of fabric brushing against their doors, a sound too delicate to belong to thieves or beasts, yet too insistent to be imagination. And children began to speak of a woman standing at the edges of their fields, her gown flowing though there was no wind, her head tilted unnaturally as though she were listening to something deep within the earth. And when asked to describe her face, the children could not. They would only say it shifted, sometimes beautiful and serene, like a bride on her wedding day, other times hollow-eyed and skeletal, a grin carved wider than any human mouth should allow. And the parents who punished their children for speaking such things quickly discovered that silence brought no protection, for dreams of the bride soon infected them as well, dreams of walking down an aisle that stretched endlessly into blackness, of vows whispered not by a priest, but by a voice that had no origin, only an echo that promised union not with a man or with God, but with something else, something older, something that waited beyond the veil of the chapel ruins. And when these dreamers awoke, they found dirt beneath their fingernails and damp hemlines, as though they had truly walked the seminary's corridors while their bodies slept, their shoes carrying mud only found near the ruin's foundations, and though they swore they had never left their beds, the evidence mocked their denials until whole families abandoned their homes and fled the valley, leaving doors ajar, food still warm on the stove, and livestock untethered. Yet the bride's procession never waned, and the abandoned houses became part of her dominion, their windows reflecting her form even when no one stood there, as if the seminary's curse had spread through every timber, every brick, binding the valley into one vast cathedral of rot where no prayer could rise high enough to be heard. By the time whispers reached the outer parishes and even the ears of state officials, the valley had already begun to change in ways no earthly jurisdiction could legislate against, for the bride was no longer confined to the seminary ruins nor to the nightly corridors of dreams, but had woven herself into the very fabric of the land, a creeping dominion that twisted soil and sky alike, so that crops blackened in their stalks, though rain fell and sun shone, Livestock birthed stillborn calves with eyes sealed shut and mouths full of soil, and travelers who passed through spoke of hearing wedding bells tolling in the dead of night, though no church within 50 miles possessed a working steeple. And still, the most horrifying transformation was not in the land, but in the people. For those who lingered too long began to lose themselves to the bride's vow, speaking in voices that were not their own, reciting half-remembered fragments of ceremonies that sounded both sacred and blasphemous, until entire families gathered in the fields at dusk, walking in procession as if summoned by some inaudible choir, their eyes glazed and their mouths slack, following an invisible bride down invisible aisles. And when at last outsiders attempted to break these trances with force, they found the bodies of the entranced stiff as oak and cold as marble, refusing to yield to restraint, as though they had been carved into effigies of devotion. And more chilling still, when these processions ended and the people returned to their homes, they remembered nothing, only that their dreams were full of vows they did not make and hands they did not hold, leaving them with bruised wrists, torn clothing, and the taste of dirt upon their tongues, as though they had kissed the ground itself in fealty to something buried beneath it. And it was then, with the valley's boundaries dissolving into a kingdom of nightmare, that the church, reluctant for decades, was finally forced to confront what could no longer be ignored, dispatching clerics, investigators, and even soldiers, not to tend to the faithful, but to silence the valley before its contagion spilled beyond its borders. For the bride had ceased to be a legend, and had become a law of the place, a covenant stronger than blood, older than scripture, and more binding than any oath the world of men had ever known. When the church's emissaries finally descended into the valley, they did so with the arrogance of men convinced that scripture could silence stone and fire could cauterize memory. But from the moment their boots struck the blackened fields, it was clear that the bride's dominion was neither of flesh nor spirit alone, but of both, a covenant that mocked the boundaries of heaven and hell alike. For the soldiers they brought carried torches and powder, while the priests clutched relics and recited exorcisms so old their syllables cracked in their throats. Yet the land responded not with submission, but with mockery, bells ringing though no tower swung, hymns echoing though no choir sang. And when they breached the seminary ruins, determined to cleanse the foundation stone that local whispers called her altar, the walls themselves seemed to breathe, mortar pulsing with a rhythm like a hidden heart. And the crucifixes they nailed to the charred beams melted into slag that smoked with a stench of blood, as though the bride was consuming every symbol placed against her. And then came the moment that stripped away their arrogance, for the soldiers who had been ordered to torch the chapel hall suddenly froze, eyes rolling back as their bodies bent into grotesque bows, and from their mouths poured vows in the tongue of the dead, each voice intoning in harmony a bridal pledge that had no human author, while the priests screamed and splashed holy water that steamed into vapor before it touched the men. And when one dared strike the possessed with a silver crucifix, the soldier's skin split open like a seam, but rather than blood, a dark lace spilled forth, weaving itself into a veil that wrapped his face until he suffocated on the fabric of the vow itself, collapsing in silence. And yet even in death his mouth continued to move, reciting promises to a bride who never stood before it. And as panic spread, the churchmen realized they had not come to banish a demon, but had walked willingly into a wedding. Guests forced into roles they could neither refuse nor survive, their every prayer only binding them tighter into the ceremony, until the last priest understood in terror that the bride did not need to destroy them, for they had already pledged themselves by entering their intrusion, the acceptance of an invitation that had been written in blood a century earlier. And what followed was not a battle, but a consummation, the ruins echoing with the cries of men devoured by vows, swallowed not by fire, but by covenant, as the valley sealed their fate into its unholy ledger forever. What survives of that night is not scripture, but silence. For though the church proclaimed victory and erected a small shrine where the seminary once stood, No body of priest or soldier was ever retrieved, only their armor and vestments, arranged neatly in a circle upon the black earth, as if laid out for inspection by a hand that wanted them remembered as trophies. And in the decades that followed, the shrine itself rotted, its wooden beams collapsing faster than any structure nearby, until it became nothing more than a scar of scorched stone, ringed by weeds that never bloomed. And yet those who dared walk near swore they could hear whispers carried on the wind, a bridal chorus murmuring vows into ears that did not belong to husbands, while more than one man reported waking days later with a ring of bruises around his finger, as though he had worn a band too tight to remove, though no gold nor silver was ever found. And so the legend grew that the bride of the seminary does not rest within her ruined valley, but moves outward, claiming guests for a wedding that never ended, her covenant expanding each time her story is spoken aloud, as though each telling becomes an invitation, each listener a potential witness to the ceremony. And what is most unsettling is the suggestion in old parish records, now buried in archives, that those who vanish without explanation in the town circling that valley, farmers, school teachers, children wandering home, may not be lost to misfortune at all, but bound by vows older than their own lives, conscripted into a bridal march that began the night the seminary burned and has not yet ceased. For some investigators of the 20th century claim to hear bells tolling from beneath the soil, not once or twice, but in the precise sequence of a wedding peal, and when the ground was tested, the instruments recorded seismic tremors matching a heartbeat, impossibly steady, pulsing still beneath the earth as though the altar stone laid there was less a remnant of ruin than a womb. And if that is true, then the bride of the seminary is not dead, not a ghost, but something older and far more dangerous, a covenant given flesh, a union of vow and void, waiting for the moment the world forgets to call her myth, so that she may rise again, veil unfurling, eyes like hollowed stars, hand extended to claim not just one valley, but an entire people who never understood that they had been walking toward her altar for centuries.